The Jamison family, a mystery that refuses to die, that in the age of smartphones, GPS tracking, and forensic DNA analysis, an entire family could vanish into thin air in broad daylight, leaving behind more questions than answers, and that 4 years later, when their remains were finally discovered, the mystery would only deepen, becoming one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. On a crisp October morning in 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn Jamison, along with their 6-year-old daughter Madison, climbed into their pickup truck in Eufaula, Oklahoma, excited about the prospect of purchasing 40 acres of land where they could build their dream home and live a simpler, self-sufficient life away from the complications of modern society. But by nightfall, they had disappeared without a trace, and the evidence left behind would send investigators spiraling into a nightmare of contradictions, strange behaviors, unexplained cash, occult symbols, and theories ranging from drug cartels to satanic cults, creating a puzzle so complex that even today, 15 years later, nobody can say with certainty what happened during those final hours in the remote woods of southeastern Oklahoma. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery, let me paint you a picture of who the Jamisons really were, because understanding their lives is crucial to unraveling the secrets of their deaths. And what you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about the fragility of the human psyche, the hidden dangers lurking in small-town America, and the terrifying reality that sometimes people we think we know are living double lives filled with darkness we cannot begin to imagine. Bobby Dale Jamison was 38 years old, a former mechanic who had been involved in a serious car accident that left him unable to work, forcing him to rely on disability benefits to support his family. And while on the surface he seemed like an ordinary American father trying to make the best of a difficult situation, beneath that facade there were whispers of family conflicts, restraining orders, and allegations that would later emerge, suggesting his life was far more complicated than anyone realized. His wife, Sherilyn, was 40 years old, a woman described by some friends as quirky and spiritual, with interests that ranged from alternative medicine to what some would later claim were darker, more occult fascinations. Though whether these interests were harmless curiosity or something more sinister remains a subject of intense debate among those who knew her and those who have studied this case obsessively over the years. Then there was Madison, just 6 years old, a blonde-haired little girl who loved her family and her dog, a child who should have had decades of life ahead of her, birthdays and graduations and first loves and children of her own, but instead became one of the most tragic figures in this entire story, an innocent soul caught in circumstances she could never understand or escape. The Jamisons had been living in Eufaula, a small city in eastern Oklahoma, with a population of just under 3,000 people. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where secrets are hard to keep, and where the sudden disappearance of an entire family would send shockwaves through the community that are still felt to this day. In the months leading up to their disappearance, Bobby and Sherilyn had been making plans to purchase undeveloped land near Red Oak, a town even smaller than Eufaula, with the intention of moving a large storage container they already owned onto the property and converting it into temporary living quarters while they built a permanent home using the proceeds from selling their current house. And while this plan might seem unusual to some, it reflected a growing movement in America towards simpler living, off-grid lifestyles, and self-sufficiency that has only become more popular in the years since their deaths. On the morning of October 8, 2009, security cameras at the Jamison residence captured footage that would later become one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, showing Bobby and Sherilyn loading items into their pickup truck in preparation for the 30-mile journey to Red Oak. But what makes this footage so disturbing is not what they were doing, but how they were doing it. For over an hour, the couple moved back and forth between their house and the truck in what can only be described as a trance-like state, walking with stiff mechanical movements, never speaking to each other, never acknowledging each other's presence, occasionally stopping mid-stride to stand completely still and stare into space for several seconds before resuming their robotic packing routine. And perhaps most bizarrely, they would place items in the truck, then remove them and carry them back into the house, only to bring them out again minutes later and load them once more, repeating this process multiple times with the same objects as if they had forgotten what they had just done or were operating on some kind of autopilot that kept malfunctioning. Experts who have reviewed this footage have offered various explanations, from sleep deprivation to drug intoxication to some kind of psychological break, but nobody can say for certain what was causing this deeply unsettling behavior. And when you watch it yourself, you cannot shake the feeling that you are witnessing two people who are not fully in control of their own actions, as if they were puppets being manipulated by invisible strings, or individuals under some form of influence that had stripped away their normal human spontaneity and replaced it with something cold and mechanical. Loading their dog Maisie into the truck, along with their daughter Madison, the Jamisons finally departed their property around 10 in the morning, and that security footage would be the last confirmed sighting of them alive. The last time anyone can say with absolute certainty that they saw Bobby, Sherilyn and little Madison together as a family. The drive to Red Oak should have taken less than an hour under normal circumstances, following rural highways through the rolling hills and dense forests of southeastern Oklahoma, an area known for its natural beauty, but also for its isolation, its poverty, and its problems with drug production and distribution, particularly methamphetamine, which had become an epidemic in rural America by the late 2000s. When the Jamisons failed to return home that evening, nobody was immediately alarmed because they had no set schedule, no employer expecting them, no rigid routine that would make their absence immediately noticeable. But as days turned into a week, and they missed prearranged meetings with friends and family members, people began to worry. And on October 16th, 8 days after the family had left home, a group of hunters exploring the remote woods near the town of Kinta, roughly 40 miles from Red Oak, stumbled upon something that would transform this from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. The Jamisons' pickup truck sat abandoned on a mountain road, locked and seemingly untouched, but when the hunters looked inside, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Maisie, the family dog, was still inside the vehicle, barely alive, severely malnourished and dehydrated, having gone without food or water for over a week, in what must have been an agonizing ordeal for the poor animal. And if a beloved family pet had been left to suffer and potentially die, what did that say about the fate of the humans who had abandoned her? Law enforcement was called immediately, and when deputies arrived and forced entry into the vehicle to rescue the dying dog, they discovered a scene that made no sense whatsoever. A collection of items that seemed to tell a story, but in a language nobody could understand. Bobby's wallet was in the truck, containing his identification and credit cards, everything a person would need if they were planning to conduct business or purchase property. And Sherilyn's purse was there as well, meaning neither parent had their identification with them if they had left the vehicle, which seemed to rule out any scenario where they had deliberately walked away to start a new life elsewhere. A mobile phone was found in the truck, and when investigators examined it, they discovered that the last photo taken was of Madison, snapped the day before the family disappeared while they were still at home, showing the little girl with an expression that some have described as normal childhood innocence, while others insist she looks frightened or distressed, though interpretations of this photograph vary wildly depending on who is analyzing it and what theory they are trying to support. Perhaps most importantly, investigators found a GPS device in the vehicle, and when they accessed its data, they discovered that the Jamisons had driven to the top of a nearby hill, a location that was subsequently searched for footprints, and while some degraded prints were found, the heavy rainfall that had occurred in the days following the disappearance had washed away most of the evidence, making it impossible to determine how many people had been at that location or where they had gone afterward. But the discovery that truly shocked investigators and would become the most debated piece of evidence in the entire case was found beneath the driver's seat. A small bag containing $32,000 in cash, an amount of money so large and so unexpected that it immediately raised 1,000 questions about where it came from, why the Jamisons had it, and why it had been left behind untouched if this was a robbery or a drug deal gone wrong. For a family living on disability benefits, struggling financially to the point where they were planning to kill. The remains were positioned face down, lying close together as if the family had been lined up execution style or had died while huddled together seeking comfort in their final moments. And the location was rugged, overgrown terrain, that would have been extremely difficult for the family to reach on foot, especially with a 6-year-old child, raising immediate questions about whether they had walked there voluntarily or been forced or even carried there after death. Dr. Joshua Lant, the state medical examiner, conducted autopsies on all 3 sets of remains, but 4 years of exposure to the elements, 4 years of decomposition and animal scavenging, 4 years of Oklahoma weather beating down on these bodies had destroyed most of the forensic evidence that might have revealed how they died. And what Dr. Lant discovered, or more accurately what he failed to discover, would frustrate everyone seeking answers in this case. There were no bullet holes in any of the skulls or other bones, ruling out the most obvious form of homicide. No fractures or other signs of blunt force trauma that would indicate they had been beaten to death. No knife marks on the bones suggesting stabbing. Essentially no physical evidence of external violence whatsoever, which should have been good news, except that it made determining what actually killed them nearly impossible. Toxicology tests came back negative for poisons or drugs, though this result must be interpreted carefully because 4 years of decomposition would have eliminated most chemical traces anyway, making it impossible to say definitively whether they had been poisoned or drugged, only that no traces remained detectable after all that time. There were no signs of disease or natural medical conditions that could explain 3 relatively young, healthy people dying simultaneously in the woods, and ultimately, Dr. Lant could only conclude that while the deaths were highly suspicious, no definitive cause of death could be determined based on the physical evidence available, leaving the question of how they died officially unanswered and open to interpretation. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office, tasked with investigating the deaths, put forward their official theory that the Jamison family had died of misadventure, meaning they had walked into the woods, possibly become lost or disoriented, and succumbed to exposure and hypothermia. A theory that, while neat and tidy and requiring no complicated explanations of criminal conspiracies or occult rituals, was immediately rejected by almost everyone familiar with the case as being completely inadequate to explain the known facts. The problems with the exposure theory are numerous and significant, starting with the weather conditions during the time of their disappearance, because while there had been heavy rainfall in the days following October 8th, making the search difficult and washing away evidence, the temperatures had not dropped to anywhere near freezing, and both adults should have been physically capable of walking the 3 or 4 miles back to their truck, even in poor weather conditions. So why hadn't they? If one member of the family, perhaps Madison, had become injured or too exhausted to walk, why hadn't one parent stayed with her while the other went for help? A logical strategy that any reasonable person would employ when facing a survival situation with a child. And why had they walked 3 miles deeper into the wilderness rather than returning to their vehicle, which was much closer and contained shelter, supplies, and that massive amount of cash? The family had taken no camping gear, no food supplies, no warm clothing, nothing that would suggest they had planned to spend any extended time outdoors, which means if they did walk into those woods, they expected to return quickly. So what prevented them from doing so? And why were their bodies found so far from the truck if they were simply taking a short walk? Bobby's relatives pointed out that if he had known about the $32,000 in the truck, there is absolutely no way he would have willingly left it unattended. And they also insisted he would never have abandoned Maisie, the family dog, to suffer and die alone in that vehicle, suggesting that something must have prevented him from returning, either by force or by death, making the official explanation seem woefully inadequate. The discovery of the bodies, rather than providing closure, only opened up new avenues for speculation and conspiracy theories. And over the years since 2013, researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and armchair detectives have proposed dozens of different explanations for what might have happened to the Jamison family. Each theory supported by some evidence but undermined by other facts, creating a frustrating situation where every explanation seems both possible and impossible at the same time. The first major theory centers on Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison, a man who had become estranged from his son in the months before the disappearance, and the circumstances of that estrangement are deeply troubling and potentially relevant to understanding what happened. In April of 2009, just 6 months before his family vanished, Bobby had filed a restraining order, against his 67-year-old father, and in the court documents supporting that request, Bobby made shocking allegations that his father was involved with local methamphetamine manufacturers and criminal motorcycle gangs, and that Bob Dean had threatened him with violence on multiple occasions, creating a rift in the family that had divided relatives into camps supporting one side or the other. If Bobby's allegations were true, and he had real knowledge of his father's criminal activities, it's possible that Bob Dean or his associates decided to eliminate Bobby and his family to protect their operations or to punish Bobby for going to the authorities. And the execution-style positioning of the bodies, the apparent lack of struggle, and the location deep in the woods all fit with the methodology of organized crime killings, where the goal is to make bodies difficult to find and to send a message to others who might consider cooperation with law enforcement. However, there are significant problems with this theory, starting with the fact that no concrete evidence has ever been presented linking Bob Dean Jamison to any criminal organization or to the deaths of his son's family. And while the restraining order is a matter of public record, allegations made in such documents are not necessarily true and could have been motivated by family conflicts unrelated to actual criminal activity. More importantly, if this was a professional hit by experienced criminals, why would they leave $32,000 in cash in the truck? An amount of money that would be a significant windfall for any criminal organization and could have been taken without consequence since the only witnesses were already dead. And why would they leave the truck itself in a location where it would be found relatively quickly, rather than disposing of it or destroying it to eliminate evidence? The second major theory, and the one that seems to have the most support from both investigators and people who knew the family, is that the Jamisons were involved in the drug trade, specifically the manufacture or distribution of methamphetamine, and that their deaths resulted from a deal gone wrong, a dispute with other criminals, or retaliation for some perceived betrayal or theft. This theory would explain the large amount of cash in the truck, which is consistent with payment for drug transactions rather than legitimate business, and it would account for the family's bizarre behavior on the security camera footage, which many people who have experience with methamphetamine users insist is classic tweaking behavior. The paranoid, repetitive, mechanical movements of people who have been awake for days, using stimulants and whose brains are no longer functioning normally. The financial situation of the family supports this theory because the Jamisons owned multiple properties, including their home and the land where the storage container sat. They owned multiple vehicles, including the truck, and reportedly a boat. They had access to $32,000 in cash, and yet neither adult was employed, and they were supposedly living on disability benefits that would not have been sufficient to support this lifestyle, suggesting income from an illegal source that they were keeping hidden from authorities and from most people in their lives. Proponents of the drug theory point out that the area where the family disappeared is well known as a center for methamphetamine production, with numerous meth labs hidden in the remote forests where law enforcement has difficulty conducting surveillance. And it's possible the Jamisons were meeting with suppliers or customers, or perhaps they stumbled across a meth lab while scouting their land and were killed by the operators, who couldn't risk being discovered and reported. The behavior captured on their home security system has been analyzed frame by experts in substance abuse and addiction, and many of them point to specific indicators that suggest the couple was under the influence of powerful stimulants, the repetitive movements that serve no logical purpose, the complete lack of verbal communication between two people who should have been discussing their plans and coordinating their packing, the blank stares into empty space as if their minds had temporarily disconnected from their bodies, and the obsessive-compulsive patterns of loading and unloading the same items multiple times as if they couldn't remember whether they had already packed them or not. These are all classic signs of methamphetamine intoxication, particularly in people who have been using for extended periods and whose sleep deprivation has reached dangerous levels. And if Bobby and Sherilyn were indeed high on meth when they left their home that morning, it would explain why they made such catastrophically poor decisions, why they might have brought Madison with them to a dangerous situation, and why they ended up dying in circumstances that seem inexplicable for sober, rational adults making careful choices. However, this theory also has significant weaknesses, Most notably, the question of why any parents, no matter how addicted to drugs or desperate for money, would bring their 6-year-old daughter along to a dangerous drug deal, risking her safety in a way that seems incomprehensible, even for people whose judgment is impaired by substance abuse. And why would criminals involved in a drug deal gone wrong leave $32,000 behind, money that presumably would have been the payment for whatever transaction was taking place? Some versions of the drug theory attempt to address these objections by suggesting that the Jamisons weren't planning to conduct a drug deal at all, but rather had stumbled upon someone else's operation, perhaps a methamphetamine laboratory hidden in the woods, and were murdered by the operators to prevent them from reporting what they had seen to law enforcement. This would explain why Madison was with them, because they had no intention of involving themselves in criminal activity and simply got unlucky. And it would explain why the money was left in the truck, because the killers might not have known it was there, or might have been in such a hurry to dispose of the bodies and flee the scene that they didn't take time to thoroughly search the vehicle. The third theory takes the case in a much darker and more disturbing direction, into the realm of the occult, satanic cults, and ritual murder, a theory that sounds like something from a horror film, but is supported by some genuinely strange evidence that cannot be easily explained away. Sherilyn Jamison's mother, Connie Cocoton, told investigators a chilling story about being approached by an unknown woman during the period when her daughter's family was still missing. A woman who claimed to be a member of a satanic cult operating across Oklahoma, and who informed Connie that Sherilyn's name appeared on a kill list maintained by the cult's leader, suggesting that the family had been targeted for death as part of some ritualistic purpose, or because Sherilyn had somehow offended or betrayed the organization. This account is supported, or at least complicated, by claims from people who knew Sherilyn that she had an interest in witchcraft and the occult, and by the discovery of what has been described as a satanic Bible or witchcraft manual in the Jamison home, though Sherilyn's friend Nikki Chenault insisted this book was purchased as a joke gift and did not represent any serious involvement in occult practices. The graffiti on the storage container making references to witches and cats takes on a more sinister significance if Sherilyn was indeed involved with people practicing some form of dark spirituality, and the remote location where the bodies were found, the apparent lack of struggle, and the positioning of the remains could be interpreted as consistent with some kind of ritual killing, though this requires a belief in the existence of organized satanic cults committing murders, something that law enforcement and mainstream criminology generally dismiss as moral panic and urban legend rather than reality. The occult theory gained additional traction when it was revealed that the area around Kinta and the surrounding forests had a local reputation for being associated with witchcraft, satanic activity, and paranormal phenomena, with numerous residents reporting strange occurrences, unexplained lights in the woods at night, and rumors of groups conducting rituals in remote locations where they wouldn't be disturbed by authorities or curious onlookers. Whether these rumors have any basis in reality or are simply the product of small-town gossip and the human tendency to create supernatural explanations for things we don't understand is impossible to determine with certainty, but they created an atmosphere of fear and speculation that surrounded the Jamison case from the very beginning. The occult theory is compelling in its way because it would explain evidence that other theories struggle with, such as the bizarre behavior on the security camera, which could be interpreted as people under some form of spiritual influence or drugged for ritual purposes, and the $32,000, which might have been payment to the cult or money Sherilyn had stolen from them, but it requires acceptance of a criminal organization operating in plain sight in rural Oklahoma, for which there is virtually no verified evidence, and it struggles to explain why a cult would leave such a large amount of money behind if money was part of the motive. Some researchers have pointed out that if the Jamisons were killed as part of a ritual murder, the perpetrators might have had no interest in the cash because their motive was spiritual or ideological rather than financial, and taking the money might have somehow contaminated or invalidated whatever ritual they were performing. Though this reasoning requires a level of speculation about the beliefs and practices of a group whose very existence is questionable. The fourth theory, perhaps the most tragic of all, is that one member of the family most likely Sherilyn, based on the alleged 11-page letter expressing intentions to kill Bobby, committed murder-suicide, killing her husband and daughter before taking her own life, possibly while in the grip of mental illness, severe depression, or under the influence of drugs that distorted her thinking and removed her inhibitions against violence. This theory would explain why all three family members are dead in the same location, why there were no signs of struggle suggesting they were taken by force, and why the money was left behind, since a person planning suicide would have no use for cash and no reason to take it with them. And the letter, if it exists and is authentic, provides direct evidence of murderous intent, at least toward Bobby, if not toward Madison. Mental health professionals who have reviewed the case have noted that Sherilyn had reportedly been struggling with depression and anxiety, and that the family's financial difficulties, Bobby's disability and inability to work, and the stress of planning a major lifestyle change could have created a perfect storm of psychological pressure that pushed someone who was already vulnerable into a state of crisis where violence seemed like the only solution. The murder-suicide theory suggests that Sherilyn might have convinced Bobby to take a walk into the woods, perhaps under the pretense of scouting their new land or having a private family moment away from the stress of their daily lives. And once they were far enough from the truck that escape would be difficult, she revealed her true intentions and either forced them at gunpoint to continue walking until they reached the location where their bodies were eventually found, or she drugged them in some way that left no trace after 4 years of decomposition, causing them to become disoriented and unable to find their way back. However, the murder-suicide theory faces enormous obstacles in explaining the physical evidence, most critically the absence of any weapon at the scene or in the truck, because it is functionally impossible for someone to kill 2 other people and themselves without using some instrument to inflict fatal injuries, whether a gun, a knife, poison, or some other means, and no such weapon was ever found despite extensive searches. The autopsy revealed no evidence of gunshot wounds, stabbing, strangulation, or blunt force trauma, and while it's theoretically possible that Sherilyn could have poisoned Bobby and Madison before poisoning herself, the toxicology tests found no traces of poison, though again the degradation of the bodies means this is not definitive proof that poison wasn't used, only that none was detectable 4 years later. Even if we accept that somehow Sherilyn managed to kill her family and herself using a method that left no physical traces and no weapon behind, this theory still doesn't explain why they walked 3 miles into the wilderness to do it, why she would choose such a difficult and uncomfortable location rather than staying in the truck or going somewhere with more meaning to the family. And it doesn't explain the bizarre behavior on the security camera, which predated whatever happened in the woods, and suggests that both Bobby and Sherilyn were already in an altered state before they even left home. Looking at all these theories together, what becomes clear is that each one contains elements that make sense and elements that don't, pieces of the puzzle that fit, and pieces that seem to belong to an entirely different picture. And the truth, if we ever discover it, probably lies somewhere in the intersection of multiple explanations, a complex situation where drug use affected the family's behavior. Family conflicts created vulnerabilities, and perhaps criminal elements or dangerous individuals took advantage of a family in crisis, resulting in 3 deaths that nobody intended, but that became inevitable once a chain of bad decisions was set in motion. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Jamison family was struggling with problems they kept hidden from most people around them, that beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary life, there were financial issues, possible substance abuse, family conflicts, and perhaps involvement with dangerous people or dangerous activities, and that on October 8, 2009, those hidden problems came to a catastrophic conclusion in the woods outside Kinta, Oklahoma. The investigation into the Jamison family deaths revealed a pattern that law enforcement sees all too often in cases involving rural poverty, addiction, and social isolation. A family that appeared to be functioning normally to casual observers, but was actually caught in a downward spiral of financial desperation, substance abuse, and involvement with criminal elements, all while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy and keep their struggles hidden from friends, family, and authorities who might have been able to intervene before tragedy struck. The $32,000 in cash which remains one of the most baffling pieces of evidence in the entire case, almost certainly came from some kind of illegal source, because there is simply no legitimate explanation for how an unemployed couple living on disability benefits could accumulate that amount of money. And the fact that they kept it hidden in their truck, rather than depositing it in a bank account, suggests they knew they couldn't explain its origin if questioned by authorities. Whether that money came from drug dealing, from some kind of settlement or inheritance that they failed to report to the Social Security Administration because it would have affected their disability benefits, from criminal activity by Bobby's father that somehow ended up in their possession, or from some other illicit source we haven't even considered, is impossible to determine with certainty. But what is certain is that money of that magnitude doesn't appear out of nowhere, and its presence in the truck is a clear indication that the Jamisons were involved in something they wanted to keep secret. The behavior captured on the security camera footage, which has been analyzed and debated endlessly by everyone from professional forensic psychologists to armchair detectives on internet forums, represents perhaps the clearest window we have into the mental and physical state of Bobby and Sherilyn in the hours before they disappeared. And what that window shows us is deeply disturbing because it depicts two people who are clearly not functioning normally, whose movements and actions suggest either severe intoxication, extreme sleep deprivation, psychological dissociation, or some combination of all three. The fact that they spent over an hour packing their truck, moving with mechanical precision but without any apparent purpose or plan, suggests that whatever they were experiencing had robbed them of their ability to think clearly, to communicate effectively, and to make rational decisions about their own safety and the safety of their daughter. And this impairment, whatever its cause, almost certainly played a role in the series of events that led to their deaths. The photo of Madison found on Bobby's phone, taken just one day before the family disappeared, haunts everyone who has studied this case because it shows a little girl who had no idea that her life was about to end, a child who trusted her parents to keep her safe and who paid the ultimate price for adult decisions and adult problems she could never have understood or controlled. Whether Madison died quickly or slowly, whether she was frightened or comfortable, whether she understood what was happening or remained innocent until the very end. These are questions that torment anyone with empathy who considers this case. And the fact that we may never know the answers, may never be able to give her story the ending it deserves, is perhaps the most painful aspect of this entire tragedy. Some investigators have suggested that Madison might have become ill or injured while the family was in the woods, and that Bobby and Sherilyn's inability to get her back to the truck or to get help might have been the critical factor that turned what could have been a recoverable situation into a fatal one. And this theory has some merit, because it would explain why the family didn't simply return to their vehicle once they realized they were in trouble. If Madison collapsed or became unable to walk, and if Bobby and Sherilyn were themselves impaired by drugs, exhaustion, or dehydration, they might have found themselves in a situation where they couldn't carry her the 3 miles back to the truck and couldn't leave her alone to go for help, trapping all 3 of them in the woods, where they eventually succumbed to exposure, dehydration, or some other environmental factor that killed them, but left no obvious physical evidence on their remains. Maisie the dog, who survived her ordeal in the truck and was adopted by a loving family afterward, is the only member of the Jamison household who lived through whatever happened that October. And if only she could speak, if only we could access whatever memories she has of that day, perhaps we would finally understand what transpired. But she cannot tell us, and so the mystery remains, a dark void in our understanding that we try to fill with theories and speculation, but which ultimately resists all our attempts to illuminate it. The fact that Maisie was left locked in the truck for over a week with no food or water is itself a significant piece of evidence, because it tells us that whatever happened to the Jamisons happened suddenly and unexpectedly, that they did not plan to be gone for an extended period, and that they either couldn't return to the vehicle or were prevented from returning by force or by death. Bobby and Sherilyn clearly loved their dog, and no one who knew them believes they would have deliberately left her to suffer and die, which means that their failure to return to the truck was not a choice but a result of circumstances beyond their control. Whether those circumstances were an accident, a crime, or some combination of factors that we haven't fully understood, the case remains officially open, meaning that if new evidence emerges, or if someone with knowledge of what happened decides to come forward, charges could potentially be filed and justice could be served. But with each passing year, this becomes less likely. Witnesses die or disappear, physical evidence continues to degrade, and the cultural moment when this case was fresh and people were paying attention fades into history, replaced by new tragedies and new mysteries that capture public attention. For the families of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison, there is no closure, no final chapter that explains what happened and allows them to move forward with their grief. Only an endless series of questions that circle back on themselves, and a frustration that in an age when we can sequence DNA and track people's movements through their phones and solve decades-old cold cases with new technology, we still cannot answer the basic question of what happened to 3 people who vanished in broad daylight just 15 years ago. The Jamison family case reminds us that there are still dark corners in America, places where people can disappear, where crimes can occur without witnesses, where the wilderness is vast enough and isolated enough that bodies can lie undiscovered for years, just miles from where searchers are looking, and where the combination of poverty, drugs, family dysfunction, and violence can create situations that end in tragedy without anyone being held accountable. It reminds us that the people we see every day, our neighbors and acquaintances and the family at the grocery store, may be living secret lives we know nothing about, struggling with demons we cannot see, involved in activities we would never suspect, and that sometimes those secret lives end in ways that shock us and force us to confront how little we truly know about the world around us. As we close this investigation into one of Oklahoma's most baffling mysteries, we are left with more questions than answers, with theories that seem plausible until we examine them closely and then fall apart under scrutiny, with evidence that points in multiple directions simultaneously and refuses to resolve into a coherent narrative, and ultimately with 3 graves holding people who deserved better than the fate they received, and who deserved better than to have their deaths remain unexplained, and their killers, if there were killers, unpunished. Perhaps someday, someone will come forward with information that breaks this case wide open, perhaps a deathbed confession, or a discovery of hidden documents, or a new witness who was too afraid to speak before but who finally finds the courage to tell what they know. And when that happens, if it happens, the Jamison family will finally receive the justice they have been denied for so long. But until that day comes, their story remains a warning about the fragility of life, the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of ordinary existence, and the terrible reality that sometimes people vanish into darkness and we never discover what happened to them. No matter how hard we search or how desperately we want answers, Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison deserve to be remembered not just as victims of an unsolved mystery, not just as names in a true crime case that people discuss and debate, but as real human beings who lived and loved and had hopes and dreams and who met an end that should never have happened. And if this retelling of their story does nothing else, let it serve as a memorial to 3 lives that ended too soon, and a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for justice, and still mourning the loss of people they loved who never came home. And may their souls rest in peace, knowing that, even though we may never fully understand what happened to them, they are not forgotten. Their story continues to be told, and the search for truth, however elusive it may be, continues in their memory.